Serve University School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. This is the All Access Med School Admissions Podcast. Hello again, everybody. I'm your host, Christian Usman, and I'm the Senior Director of Admissions and Financial Aid here at the medical school. And this is the summer vacation episode, as I worked on this one a little bit while I was on a recent family vacation. So I had to drop in some of those wave sounds because it makes me think of vacation, and maybe it takes you to a special place too. So, all right, this is a long-awaited episode for some listeners because I've heard from several people that they'd like to hear from someone in an MSTP or medical scientist training program on my show. Well, if you've been waiting, this one's for you, and I think I found the right person to bring you a boatload of information. Now, I know some of you may not be as familiar with this type of medical degree and training, so let me tell you a little bit about what MSTP programs are about. MSTP is an integrated program combining the elements of an MD and PhD curricula to give students an individualized learning experience that's tailored to their backgrounds and goals in medicine and science. MSTP students participate in both medical and graduate school activities throughout their time in the program, so which can last sometimes 8 to 9 years. So today you'll be hearing from Mr. Brian Sullivan, who is from the MSTP at Washington University's School of Medicine in St. Louis. The MSTP was established at Washington University in 1969 and has been very successful in training individuals as physician scientists. Since 1970, the program has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, and the program currently holds one of the largest pre-doctoral training grants in the country. The mission of the Washington University's MSTP is to prepare women and men for careers as physician scientists engaged in biomedical research, which creates new knowledge for the betterment of society. As one of the largest MD PhD programs in the United States, each year they enroll 25 talented, energetic, and compassionate individuals to undertake a rigorous training program at one of the nation's premier centers for clinical excellence in scientific research, Washington University School of Medicine. Their program offers 14 different PhD programs ranging from anthropology to molecular genetics and genomics to bioinformatics and data science. A full list of their programs can be found in the show description links that you'll find when you go through that part of the podcast. Because of the complex nature of modern science and medicine requires team-based approaches to solving problems, their MSTP emphasizes collaboration and community. So there's a little background on what MSTPs are and a little bit of some highlights of WashU's program. So let me tell you a little bit of some background about my guest today. Mr. Brian Sullivan is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. He earned a bachelor's in political science with a focus on Latin America and international law, and a master's in Spanish from St. Louis University, and an MBA from Washington University's Olin Business School Executive Program. Mr. Sullivan has a long history at Washington University and joined the university in 1983, serving in a number of administrative capacities in the Department of Cell Biology and Physiology. In 1991, he became the financial manager of the Division of Biology and Biomedical Sciences, which is an educational consortium that oversees graduate training at the School of Medicine and the Department of Biology. In 1994, he was appointed the administrative director of the medical scientist training program. And then in 2011, he became the executive director of the program. Mr. Sullivan is a member of the National Association of Advisors for the Health Professions. That's the Pre-Health Advisors Association. The National Associations of MD PhD programs, where he currently serves as a secretary and treasurer, and the Graduate Research, Education and Training Group of the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC, where he was an inaugural member of the executive board of the MD PhD section and currently serves on the Communications Committee. He has served as an external reviewer for the MD PhD programs at Northwestern University, St. Louis University, the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Pittsburgh. Mr. Sullivan has delivered and been invited to talks to every place from the National Institutes of Health to the National Association of Advisors for Health Professions, the annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minority Students, otherwise known as ABRCAMS, and many, many other organizations and all kinds of universities. He's been around the block. Finally, Mr. Sullivan and his wife are parents to 5 children, 3 of whom also currently work at Washington University. And they also are parents of 200,000 honeybees. The bottom line is Brian is incredibly knowledgeable in this area, as you'll hear, and really fun to talk with. I have to tell you that this conversation could have gone on much longer because he is so interesting to chat with, but we kept it to the MSTP related topics. So if you're thinking about MSTP programs or are just now learning about these types of programs and what they're all about, I hope that you enjoy this very informative conversation. So let's just jump right into it with Mr. Brian Sullivan. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really grateful. You're the first person I've had on my show to talk about MSTP programs. So thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to talk to you and to students and perhaps advisors around the country about MD PhD training.
Yeah, I think especially advisors are going to be excited to hear in more depth about this MD PhD programs. And then we'll talk more about WashU. But before we get into all that, you have an interesting background that I wanted to hear a little more about Brian Sullivan, because as somebody who has a degree in political science, a master's in Spanish, an MBA, how did you find yourself in this role of executive director of WashU's MSTP program?
Well, I went to school a long time ago, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and I just loved going to school. I loved classes. Every semester I would take a full load. I think it was 21 credit hours each semester, and I do summer classes. I just loved going to school. And so after I completed my political science degree, I thought, well, I'm really interested in Spanish, and I was interested perhaps in going to Latin America because I did a lot of my focus in poli-sci was on Latin America. And so I thought, well, I'll learn Spanish and be able to go there. And then I started on that road and got, towards my master's. And then I realized, what am I really going to do with this? How am I going to make this work? And I also was in a relationship at the time, and we decided we're going to get married. And it's like, okay, I need a real job. I just can't go cavorting around Latin America, stirring up trouble or anything like that. So my wife happened to get me she was a history major. Okay. So we're both, people that are doing things that have nothing to do with our degrees. So she, her best friend from history, her husband was a faculty at Washington University School of Medicine. And so she got me a job in his lab. I washed glassware. I took care of lab animals. I did all of that. And I did that for a while. And then I really didn't like lab animals. I love them, but, killing them was not my thing. And so,
right.
The guillotine and, that sort of thing, I just didn't care for that. So I worked my way into a financial position in the department. And then in 1993, they reorganized. I was in the division of biology, biomedical sciences. They reorganized it, and my position was eliminated. So here I am, my sole support for our family. We got 4 kids, and it's like, what do I do? And so the MD PhD job opened up, and it was like, well, I really like working with students. I remembered when I taught in undergrad and in graduate school. So I thought I will just take this job. And for the first 3 years, I felt like I had made the biggest mistake in my life because it is such a complicated program. But then, I've been at it now for, I guess this is my 28th year now. So, it worked out.
I guess so. Yeah. And it sounds like your children now they work at WashU too.
Yeah. In fact, my daughter, her from Vanderbilt, Christina Twist.
That's your daughter?
Yeah. She was the associate director of MD admissions there. And then when the job opened at Washington University to become director of admissions, she decided to take the job. So
I met her about back in April or May. And I think she told me, she was like, you should interview my dad.
Oh,
because
really?
He's at MSTP at WashU. And I forgot about that conversation that I had with her.
Yeah, so it's a very small world.
Wow, it just got really small. Well, we know the people at Vandy well, and Jen Kimball, and she's been on here, and I've now met your daughter at WashU. So that's great. That's great. Well, cool. Well, what an interesting. Boy, it really is a small world. That just, you've been in St. Louis for a long time. What do you, when people come in town, what do you have them like? You say, hey, these are must do's. You got to, when you check out St. Louis. Yeah.
So there's a lot of live music. And so whatever kind of music you like, we have it here. It's one of the cradles of blues, back in the, 100 years ago, people coming up from the Delta, and St. Louis is one of the stops that, some stayed here, some went to Chicago, some went to Detroit, and so on. So there's a lot of great music, and also classical music and opera and so on. So I really encourage people to, take advantage of that. And during the summer, there are free concerts somewhere in the city most days of the week. I mean, so it's really a fun and inexpensive thing to do. Yeah. And then the food scene is really great. Just a lot of wonderful restaurants here, and that's something I think our students really enjoy. In fact, they're much more up on it than I am. I remember established places, and so if I'm interested in trying something, I'll just ask a student, somebody who's say, well, what's a good Thai place to go to now, and they will come up with the recommendation. Someplace it's maybe only been open 6 or 9 months, but it's outstanding. So,
well, that yep, I can attest to that. I love music, and I went to a barbecue place in town there. It's like the famous barbecue place in St. like Slappies or
Pappy's.
Pappy's. Yeah. Man, that was a religious experience for me. So that I am all in on St. Louis barbecue. Okay. So I guess let's get down to business here.
Okay.
Because I think we could probably chit chat for a long time, but people are here to listen to the MSTP stuff. So I guess, Brian, my first big question, we're going to start with kind of the high level questions about MSTP and MD PhD programs, and then we'll talk about WashU's. But in your mind, what is the purpose of an MD PhD training?
Yeah. So, the primary purpose is to train individuals to become physician scientists. So basically the idea is that they would work in academic medical centers, doing research and doing patient care. The NIH started funding these programs back in, I think, about 1963 or something like that, because they identified a real need. Research was expanding, but you had fewer and fewer physicians who were able to do research. And so the NIH thought, well, we need to train a new biomedical research workforce. And so they started funding these sorts of programs. And one of the things they identified that kept individuals from going into academic careers was if you come out of med school with a lot of debt, it's hard to take an academic position, and one like research where, if you're doing a lot of procedures, you can generate a lot of revenue and, cover your salary and then some. But if you're doing research, it's harder and it's not as sure as it would be, if you're doing clinical work. So the NIH said this is a national need. They created these programs and started funding them. We received our funding in 1970. That was our first. We started in 69. We're funded in 1970. And so the NIH has broadened the sort of definition of what success is. It used to be, okay, they have to be in academics, blah, blah, blah. Now, they say, well, there's a wide range of things they can do. About I think 12% of our graduates are in working in pharma or in biotech, that sort of thing. And some have started their own companies. Others, like the current head and the past head of Merck, were both graduates of our program. They started in academia, but then they were recruited to pharma to run, big things, not just their own lab, but, whole research efforts. And so I think we are seeing this we've seen this change over time in terms of what acceptable, that's the wrong word, but what is a viable career for an MD PhD?
Mm-hmm. And I hear that from our MSTP programs too, that a successful outcome doesn't mean somebody necessarily goes into academia, but going into pharma or biotech is still a successful outcome. And sometimes even not going to residency, going straight to those type of industries.
Yeah. So, about most of them, I think something like 98.5% of MD PhDs will do a residency, as you would see for regular MDs, but some do move right into industry because they have something they discovered in their PhD phase and they're ready to do that. In fact, I have a student right now, they just decided not to do residency because they're going to, they started a company 3 years ago and they've been sort of working that while going back to med school and doing clinics and that. So they finally decided, okay, I'll get the MD, but then no more medicine for me.
Right. We've been kind of, before we go any further, Brian, we've been kind of saying MD, PhD and MSTP. Right. Is there a difference?
I would say no. No, we like to, on the one hand, we say, well, MSTP, they've been reviewed by the NIH. And so we have this grant. The grants are for 5 years and they're our 5-year grant is about $14 million. So it's a lot of money, but it's, every MSTP at one time was an MD PhD program, and there are incredibly high quality MD PhD programs that are in the process of applying for these grants. And it's challenging because you have schools like Case or Washington University or University of Michigan that already have grants. And so the NIH has to find money to fund new programs, like the University of Arizona, I believe, was the newest MSTP. So they worked very hard for 15 years or whatever to get their program, have a track record and make it fun, make it such that the NIH would want to fund them. And so I think there are many outstanding MD PhD programs out there that as of yet do not have MSTP funding. And on the one hand, I don't want them to take money away from my program to fund these new programs.
Limited pot.
Right, exactly. But on the other hand, I think it is important that we do have individuals training at a whole lot of different sites.
Yep. So is a prospective applicant to MD, PhD programs limited in a future career in research?
No. So, there's no obligation. At one time, the NIH did have what they called a payback obligation. And so if you're funded by the NIH, you had to do a certain number of years of service. So if you were funded by the NIH on a training grant for 5 years, you would owe them, they gave you 2 years grace and you owed them 3 years of service. So that meant you would need to do research for 3 years. And they dropped that requirement probably about 2000 or something like that. So it's been a while because they realized that it really didn't matter. People were following the MD PhD career, the physician scientist career. And so it was probably more work and money to track than to actually whatever they would gain by forcing people to do this. So, currently, there are probably nationally 15 to 20% of individuals who have MD, PhD degrees who are, primarily doing clinical work. Some of them may be in academic medical centers, but a lot of them might be in practice, private practice. And but they could still be involved in research. For instance, they could, be affiliated with clinical study, a patient study type thing. So, we haven't really been able to define what they're doing with any precision, but our idea or what we think is happening is some of them are actually still engaged in research. And even if not that, they may be, teaching or training doctors. Because that's, we talk about the physician scientists, we focus on the scientist part, and on the physician part, but they're also teachers. Mm-hmm. And that's something I think that can be overlooked when we're talking about MD, PhDs, and the teaching part is very important.
Can you kind of step us through, like, how does the MD, PhD training or MSTP training work? Like, what's that process kind of look like?
Yeah. And so there's some variability from program to program, as you might expect, because medical curriculums are a little different, but we like to think of it as a sandwich, or actually a better model might be a lasagna, because it's kind of the layers sort of intermingle. Okay. And so in the old days, everybody did this sort of same model where first 2 years preclinical, right? The traditional curriculum that goes all the way back to, the Flexner report, 115 years ago or however long ago it was. And so everybody did it that way. And then you finished up preclinical, took step one of the boards, and then you went into the PhD. And in PhD, you just focused on research 100% of the time. And then when that was done, you would come back and finish up medical school and doing clinical work. And typically that you'd have some maybe adjustments to the clinical works. So for instance, at our school, the clinical phase for MD PhDs could be as little as 15 months. So the regular med students would be doing 2 years, and MD PhDs could do as little as 15 months. Now, some of them chose to do more, and that was fine, but that was sort of the idea. Mm-hmm. So you had these very discrete layers. Now it's much more mixed, and that, the NIH recognized that we probably need to have, these students not being so, have this sort of sequential training. And so, for instance, at our program, we have like some PhD oriented things that happen during the first phase, and then individuals have potential for doing clinical things during the PhD phase. And when they come back, now that last phase, it tends to be fairly clinical because, you're preparing for residency. Mm-hmm. And so our current model is individuals do 16 months of phase one, which is kind of preclinical, but there are clinical things mixed in it. And then they would do the PhD, and then which could be, takes as long. That's the rate limiting step is the PhD. It could be 3 years. It could be 4. It could be 5. It could be 6. We don't know. And so that's where the variability comes from. And then when they come back, they do 20 months of post PhD work, which is clinical, but then there's also some didactic and perhaps research opportunities that are leavened in there.
So it really does sound like lasagna.
Yeah, exactly.
It is really kind of a mash of kind of the layers in the middle are all over the place.
Yeah.
So, but it makes sense to keep, because you want to keep the students out of those silos where they might forget some of the things they learned earlier, and keep things kind of fresh for them clinically, and also let them focus on the research aspects too. Yeah,
and some programs, they actually do a full year of clinics before they start the PhD. Mm-hmm. And others do like in our program, our students have the option of doing 4 months of clinics before they start the PhD. And in our old model, I think went back to the Flexner report. I don't think there was a major change in our curriculum since at least the Korean War anyway. So it was pretty old. It was a great curriculum, but it just didn't take advantage of, new ideas and modalities of teaching. Now it's really been modernized, and it's an exciting new curriculum. But, our students have the ability, now to do some clinical work before the PhD, and that may help inform the PhD research.
Right. You give a lot of talks to prospective applicants kind of locally and nationally. Who do you recommend to listeners? Like, who should be thinking about applying to MSTP programs?
So I think I used to use this image called the white sock test, and I don't use it anymore because I think it fell flat. It seemed it wasn't relevant anymore. But the idea was, so you're a college student and you're doing your laundry on a Sunday afternoon, and and in the dryer you have your dogs, but there's one white sock, and then you see this white sock going around, and it's like, okay, you start thinking about that in terms of, okay, is this an experiment? What can I learn from this? How many times does the white sock go around? And because it'll disappear in the dark clothes, and it'll reappear in the front of the dryer and that, and, so it's somebody who's just really intensely curious, who, when they walk into a situation, whatever it is, they start thinking about it. It's like, okay, why is this working this way? What can we learn from this? Can we design something that would test this? So it's this insatiable curiosity. And so I think individuals who are kind of that way, who can't imagine, not thinking about things, white sock aside, not thinking about, the world and how can we, explain the world better, understand the world better. I think those folks would be, good for an MD PhD program. And obviously curiosity and creativity is very important if you're a physician as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just, it's like that on steroids if you're interested in being a physician scientist.
How realistic is it for if a student is considering MD PhD to think that they'll be able to see patients and do research. I think that some students kind of have this like the sexy image, like in the morning I'm seeing patients and in the afternoon after lunch we're in the lab. Is that realistic, or is there another kind of view of that?
So I think there are a huge number of models. Again, going back, 25 years, the idea was, 80-20. That was the 80-20 split. We all talked about that 80% research, 20% clinic. So it'd be, about a day a week. But, typically, many faculty, they would do like, maybe 4 weeks of clinical time a year, and that was it. So they didn't necessarily have a weekly clinic. They would, like my boss, Wayne Yokoyama, he did his clinical stuff in the summer, right at the beginning of the summer. So he did it all done at that time. Then the rest of the year, he was focused 100% on his research. But that has changed. That's still a viable model, but we have to think about this like along a continuum. And there's some individuals who might be 100% research and never going to do clinics. Others who might be mostly clinicians, 80% in the clinics, but they probably don't run their own lab, but they're working with other faculty who are running labs or that sort of thing. And, as over time, the clinical specialties of MD PhDs have changed. It used to be, internal medicine, path, peds, and neurology. That's where 90% of the folks went. Now, probably that's accounts for 50% at best, maybe a little bit less than 50%. And we have people going into real procedural things like OB-GYN, surgery, otolaryngology. So individuals are going to things where, like, if I need brain surgery, I don't want one of my graduates do it. Well, maybe one of my graduates, because he does spend most of his time in clinics, but I don't want somebody who's only doing brain surgery, for 4 weeks out of the year, right? Yeah. I want somebody who's really good at it. Yeah. But I think there are incredible research opportunities in surgery and psychiatry and things like that. And so having people who are trained as physician scientists and spending the majority of their time doing clinical work, but being able to also do research that's relevant to that discipline is really important. And the NIH recognizes that as well. Again, I think there's been an evolution over time in terms of what the NIH and what, just the academic enterprise in general has thought about what kind of careers are appropriate for physician scientists.
When it comes to the admissions committee piece, we talk in all my other shows that this is the first MSTP focused one. We talk about what MD admissions committees look for. When it comes to the MSTP committee, what can you kind of explain, kind of maybe globally, what are they looking for in students that could have some success in these types of programs?
Yeah. So, we obviously you have to be a strong MD candidate. That's right. The thing. And I think it's not that, I'm kind of a marginal MD candidate, but I'm going to be, I have real good research background, so I would be a good candidate. You still, you're going to be licensed as a physician, so we have to make sure that you're going to be, the equivalent of the regular MDs that we are graduating. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing, is be a strong MD candidate. And then then for MD PhD, it's okay. The PhD, what are your how can we project what kind of a researcher you might be? I mean, are we able to, by reading your application, say, okay, this individual has real good foundation in research, and they show good indication that they will be able to become an independent researcher. And are they productive? Again, I mentioned curiosity earlier. This is a tip for the pre-health advisors out there. My favorite word in letters of recommendation is fearless. I like to see somebody described as a fearless researcher. And because, that means they are going to, do everything they can. They'll take on the challenging projects. They're not just going to do an iterative project. They're going to try to do something that might, be a major leap. And so they're willing to take risks. And that's something I think, as a scientist, you have to learn. I mean, as a physician, you don't have, a risk-loving physician, I don't think you want them to be kind of risk-averse. But for an MD, PhD, you want them to learn to take appropriate risks and be ready to fail a lot,
right.
and fail quickly and fail smart, right? Fail in a way that you learn something from it and you can take the next step or go down a different path then. And so that's what we're looking for is individuals who've had that sort of experience. And I know a lot of times people say, well, how many hours? And I know we always try to quantitate things. It's like, what should the MCAT be? What should the GPA be? How many hours of shadowing? How many hours for the research? And that's really squishy. I will just say, I'll put a flag right here and say 1,000 hours at least. So when you're reporting your hours on the MCAS application and you list your experiences, the total should be at least 1,000. We've and actually on our website we have a graph that shows the number of hours of the people who applied, broken down in different aliquots, and then the number that were interviewed. And so you can sort of see that under 1,000 we have a lot of people, but there's just like maybe one or two people who had under 1,000 hours that were interviewed. Really, we're thinking more about a minimum of 1,000.
Mm-hmm. But again, real quick about your website, it is very data driven. Like I love it. It really lays it out to students. They can see the numbers. Like this is what it looks like as far as like availability of interview slots, depending on where you are in that time of the season and stuff. Yeah. So I'll link to it in the description of this episode so people can go and dive a little deeper. I wanted to come back to something you were saying about like the first part of in the MSTP committee is getting approval from the MD committee and we've had those kind of conversations at our school, like the MSTP might love this candidate, but the MD committee is like, this person should not be in the MD medical school side of this. Like they could be a phenomenal PhD, but they just don't have what we think. And so we've had those I'm sure you guys have had those conversations too, that you have to satisfy both committees to keep moving on.
Yeah. And those can be tough because this guy you just really love and you go to the MD admissions committee and it's like you run into a brick wall and, but it's really important, the work that they do. And, to be honest with you, the ones we've gotten pushback on, we follow up, we don't contact them, but we just sort of follow what they're doing. And MD PhDs, I'll just say this, the programs across the country are really very collaborative, incredibly collaborative. And that's what's made why I have stuck with this career for so long. And I think a lot of people, because you have colleagues across the nation that you can, interact with, and they want to help your program. And so I will say, hey, so-and-so that, we interviewed 5 or 6 years ago, how did it work out with them? And they'll say, well, they have their issues, and so I think the med school, they're very valuable in helping us find individuals who are going to not only be great researchers, but be great physicians and contribute to the class as a whole, because that's really important.
To talk about what things the committee looks for, when you said that you kind of put the flag in instead of 1,000 hours, do MSTP committees expect publications or abstracts at conferences? Yeah, because I think that's a misconception. I think I know the answer to this, but I wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, no. So publications are not expected. I would say, maybe 20 to 25% of the applicants, each year have publications, and many of, and that's any, not even first author. That's just, you might be 15th author on a paper, right? And so it's not really expected. If you have one, that's great. We're not going to hold it against you, but we're not going to be looking for it. And I would say if you are that 15th author on a paper, make sure you really know that paper well, because if we interview you and you say, well, I worked on figure number 3, I contributed to figure number 3, but you really don't show that you have a good understanding of the paper, we're going to think, well, you aren't that curious or something, you should really be immersed in that. So I would say publications in that way could be a double-edged sword. If you really don't know that much about the work, you're just sort of contributing to the work. So if you have it, it's great. Just make sure you really know the paper. In terms of presentations, I actually think that's more valuable than publications. Because the thing about a presentation, particularly like a poster presentation or something like that, in a publication, you write, it's written for a journal and it's got all this editing and so on. A presentation, you're giving a talk or doing a poster, and your audience could be very broad, and so you got people walking up to your poster and they aren't expert in the field, or they could be expert in the field. So you have to learn how to talk to people at varying levels about your research and explain it to them in a cogent manner. And you're going to do it orally instead of doing it, written. And so I think that's what you're going to do when you interview for a program. You're going to talk about your work. And the flip side of that is, if you're at that conference, don't just give your poster and then, go out and have fun. You should actually go to other posters and you should really avail yourself of the opportunity to talk to people about their work.
Yeah.
Because you're going to, in your interviews, when you're talking to a faculty member, they're going to expect you to, ask them about their work and then follow their description and ask good questions, even if it's way outside your field of expertise. It's a skill that has to be developed over time. And so I believe that, in a way, doing presentations may be more valuable than contributing to a publication.
That's a fantastic tip. And also, there's far more opportunities to do kind of those poster presentations, because just about every college or university has like a research day or an opportunity for through the Department of Biology or Physics to have a poster presentation day. They're kind of letting you dip your toe in the water there at the university. It doesn't necessarily, what I'm hearing from you is like, it doesn't necessarily have to be at a conference either. Like, you don't have to go to the International Congress of something or other to go to give a presentation. It would be okay at the local level too, at your university or college.
Yeah. And, many students, particularly if they're from smaller colleges, they do summer undergraduate research programs, right? And those typically have a poster session or oral presentation session at the end. And that's a great opportunity to practice those skills.
Would you say that MSTP programs value more longitudinal research over a longer period of time versus having maybe 2 or 3 summers of summer research that are not connected to each other?
Yeah. I think sometimes people have the misconception that, I need to show that I'm broad in my knowledge and I can do different things. So I did a biophysics project here and then I did a genetics project. And really that doesn't help us as much, because, we're trying to assess, your potential to become an independent investigator. And if you are kind of doing a lot of different things, you're not getting any real depth in any one thing, your essays are going to reflect that. And if we interview you, it'll reflect that. And then we're kind of saying, well, he could be really good, but I just don't know, because, he's had a lot of different experiences, but he didn't go into depth in any one of them. So he hasn't had the challenges, or he hasn't been able to really contribute intellectually to a project because he's just done these short projects. So before a lot of people started doing gap years, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I would tell individuals, okay, by the beginning of your junior year, you need to find a lab and intend to stay in that lab, for the rest of your undergraduate career. And that's the absolute latest you should ideally be doing in your sophomore year. Develop that depth of understanding and a lot of experience in a particular project will be much more valuable than, saying, I have this opportunity to go to Baylor and work with this Nobel laureate for a summer. It's like, well, first of all, you're not going to see them in the hall probably. But secondly, you're just going to scratch the surface there, and then you'll be back at your home school. So I do encourage individuals to spend the summer between sophomore and junior and senior year, probably in their home institution. If it's a big research, if it's a Michigan or WashU, if you're at Beloit College or Oberlin, then you need to be going someplace else for those summers.
Yeah. What about medically related experiences? When I've seen MSTP applicants, their experiences section is naturally a little bit heavier on the research compared to their exposures to medicine, like shadowing or volunteering in a hospital or something. What's your advice to prospective applicants who are trying to satisfy these two committees that are looking at them very closely? We give a little bit, we understand, I think that we understand that an MSTP candidate is naturally going to have, there's only so many hours in the days and the weeks that they're going to be able to do some of these things. So what's your advice to prospective MSTP applicants when trying to find that, do I have enough of this and have enough of that?
Yeah. And again, I know people are going with the number, right? Okay. So I'll say 40 hours. I'll just throw it out there. 40 hours of since our medically related experience. I know with COVID and all, it's, more, and actually before COVID, there was HIPAA and there were all, so it's been harder and harder to get these these clinical or patient care exposures. But I do think it is important that they have them. And I will say that some schools, it varies a little from school to school.
Sure.
At our school, I mean, our admissions committee, MD admissions committee, they have the final say in everything, and we can, talk with them, but, they say they're going to make the final decision. Other schools, an MD PhD program may have more leeway, and the dean may say, okay, well, you have 15 spots to fill. As long as they're reasonable, I'm not going to be worried about it. And so at those places, it might be, the expectation for the clinical exposure would be less. But I would say to be safe, you really need to be thinking, minimum of 40 hours in order to, be able to satisfy what most schools are expecting.
And that goes back to, and if people have been listening to the show for a while, we wanted you to be able, it's like quality over quantity.
Yeah.
And can you, in those interviews, can you articulate some of the challenges that physicians face and have an understanding and not just be like, well, Brian Sullivan said, I got to clock in 40 hours here. So let me just, try to bang this out. And, that way I can put on my application, because people are going to sniff it out that you just were just getting it done and slapping it on your application. So
definitely.
You mentioned COVID, and that was something that I wanted to ask you. I want to just get your opinion on this, because a couple of years ago, everything shut down. Yeah. And a few moments ago, you said you were thinking maybe in sophomores should start to kind of look at research, and, everybody had a big pause put on pretty much everything in our lives. Does that worry the kind of MSTP community that maybe because a lot of the students, they get that spark in their freshman or sophomore year when they get in the labs and they're like, oh, this is really exciting. This is cool. And I'm going to keep moving. Are you, as an MSTP community, are you worried at kind of as we kind of march away from the 2020 COVID year, that you might see a decline in prospective applicants?
I think that is a good question, and we don't know yet. We do know that the year, so it would be an application year for entrance in 2021. That applications went up actually for MD PhD, but then last year they were flat, and so I do think that it may be more challenging for individuals to commit to an MD PhD program. The idea of applying to one if they haven't had, a significant amount of, research experience. And I know for us, we were sort of taking things on faith because, they've been working in a lab for 2 or 3 years, and then, now they're remote and they're not doing what they were doing. Because in the past they were doing, maybe a lot of tissue culture stuff. And now they're focusing more on the computational aspects of their work. And so we had to take, I would say risks. No, we just had to, make some assumptions about, how would we project this individual out? And, going back, I'm still trying to get around to the gap year, but going back when I first started, 15% of the individuals who were applying were in a gap year situation. Now it's 75%. And so back in the old days, that 1,000 hours of research experience, it wasn't 1,000 hours back then. It might've been more like 500 hours because, people were applying after their junior year or beginning of their senior year. And so they didn't have as much research experience. And so back then we were able to sort of tease out who we thought would be good candidates for the program. And so I think we had to, we had some muscle memory there. We just had to learn how to re-exercise that and say, okay, considering this person hasn't been able to put in as much time because of COVID, what have they shown us and what they've done so far, and how does that relate to what we think would be a successful, MD PhD student?
Yeah. Let's go to those gap years then, because we're nibbling at it every couple minutes. But I've been seeing more MSTP applicants showing up with these gap years of like IRTAs at the NIH or having paid research positions at big medical research institutions and stuff. Do you feel that's necessary? What are the long-term effects from that? Like, what's your opinion on that?
It is a real thing, and it's been building over the last quarter century. I'll start off on the good part first. Okay. So the good thing is that one of the things we've seen, and of course, correlation doesn't imply causality. However, we have seen that the attrition rate in MD PhD programs has dropped in the past quarter century. It used to be, 15%. The NIH used to say 15% attrition was an acceptable rate. So that is, 15% of the individuals who started the program did not complete. Now, they may have only done the MD. Occasionally, they would only do the MD PhD, and sometimes they may only do the PhD, and sometimes they may not complete either degree. But, the NIH thought, okay, well, 15%, you're okay. If you go above 15%, we have some concern. Now, attrition rates are like 5%. And so I think what's happened is because, and I don't think it's anything we're doing. I wish I could say, we just know how to train students better. Yeah. I don't think that's the case. I think what's happening is either we're able to better evaluate because we have more data to go on, the student has more research experience, or the individual who is trying to decide whether to apply MD PhD is better able to make that decision because they have the experience. They say, I like research, but I don't think I want to do it because I'm looking at what my PI is, what their life is like, or whatever it might be, and I'm just not as interested in that. And so I do think that people taking a gap year has actually helped individuals make a more positive commitment to being an MD PhD student following a physician scientist career. So I think that's good. And I won't say they're negatives, but it requires an investment in time. It's another year or two. And I think a lot of people could apply in their senior year, but they're electing for gap year. And if in the article that we talked about a little bit earlier, one of the things they indicate is the individuals, they're doing this. So one of the primary reasons is to be a better applicant, but also to be able to make that decision about whether they want to do this for their career. So I think spending a year or two to arrive at that decision is probably not a bad idea at all. If I'd done that, maybe I wouldn't have done the Spanish literature.
Right. I'll put links you did share with me prior to our jumping on this call here of the couple articles about gap years and MD PhD programs, and they're really interesting. So I'll put links to those in the description. So if people want to really interested in, or if they're like kind of waffling, like, should I or shouldn't I? They can look at the articles and get the insight from there. How many programs? Okay, so you said a minute ago, we're a very collaborative community, and medical school is a small community. And then you take the MD PhD community, MSTP community, it's even smaller, about 50 odd programs in the country. Right.
Yeah. Well, in terms of NIH funding for MSTP, there are probably another 40 or so MD PhD programs.
Yes. So I hear, when I'm in our committees, I hear like, I know so-and-so at that program. And when they say that, it means a lot kind of thing. And so it really is a small community. So there are fewer programs to apply to, fewer MSTP programs to apply to. So what's your advice to applicants? How many programs should they be putting on their application?
Yeah. So, it seems like the average, I believe we got this from the AAMC last year, was 15.7 applications to MD PhD programs. To me, that seems about right. You could apply to all 50 NIH funded programs, but that would be pretty wasteful. I think it costs a fortune, first of all. And then, just think of all the time you have to do with the secondaries and that. So my recommendation, 15 seems right. Pick the same advice I'm sure everybody gives, a broad range of schools. And I think for MD PhD, you have the additional thing is look at the research that's being done at that institution, make sure it aligns with yours. It's not enough to have one person, even if they are a world famous researcher, not enough to just have one person who's doing the research you're interested in at that institution. It might be far better to go to another institution where there are several people that, maybe they don't align quite as well with you, but you could see yourself doing a PhD in that lab nonetheless, and you like the community, aspect of that institution a little bit better. I think that's a much better choice than and just focusing on a few schools, just saying, well, it's a top 10 school or bust.
Yeah, I just want to get in kind of thing. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Because again, I've heard in the MSTP committees and meetings that they say, wow, this is a great candidate. But I just don't think we can support him here. We don't have the research he's interested in. Ultimately, from what we read in the application, it seemed like, but then during his interview, he said, I really like this really one thing. And like, we don't have that here. And so, which is unfortunate that we got all the way to this point. And then it's like, we can't support them. We don't, and you don't want to do that. That's you're not setting them up for success.
Right. No. And that's one of the things why I think we are very supportive of. Well, if anybody turns you down, it's tough, right?
Right.
But still, it's like, okay, you're going to another program, you're going to a program that's going to be a better fit for you. And that's important because we want you to get the best training possible, because we know that even though we have one of the largest programs in the country, we take about 25 students a year, about half of those people more than half will go to do residency elsewhere. And so they're not likely to, come back here for faculty positions. Some will, but, and we need a lot of physician scientists to replenish those that are going to retire over the years. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's important to me that if a student says, hey, Case is the best fit for me, research-wise, that they go to Case, because maybe down the road, we'll be able to recruit them here for residency or as a faculty member.
Yeah.
And so I think that programs nationwide recognize that. We see ourselves as, that's why when I'm being flippant, I say we're like McDonald's, we're just, there's one in every city, and, you go to McDonald's, you know what you're going to get, but it's not quite like McDonald's.
Right.
But I think we do share a lot of characteristics, and we share our best practices. If I come up with a great idea for what I think is a great idea for something at our annual meeting, I will brag about it and tell the other programs about it, and they'll do the same. If they've come up with something, or if they see a trend that is concerning or whatever, we'll discuss it. And then I've served as external reviewer for a number of different programs around the country, and we try to help one another out in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is a very collaborative community that we're all in. What about so applicants to whether it's medical school or they're applying to MD PhD program, they have to get letters of recommendation. Yes. What's your advice on, do they have to get any special letters for if they're applying to MSTP? Should they get at least one letter from a PI kind of thing, or should they get two, or what do you think about that?
Of course, it depends. Like if they've had, they worked in the same lab, then really they only need that one letter from that PI. The way it's stated is, we expect that you'll have letters of recommendation for everyone with whom you've had a significant research experience. And so how do you define significant, right? If it's like you may have done work in high school, but, you had 4 years of college doing research and then maybe even post-bac. So probably that high school or that freshman year letter is not going to matter as much. So, we're looking, or the short, particularly in early summer experience, like after freshman year, even sophomore year. If you did something after junior or senior year, then that's probably going to be important to us. So I would say, did you grow in that lab, in significant ways through that experience? And do you think, if you're going to write about it in your essay, you probably shouldn't get a letter for that, for that experience?
Yep. Okay. I think that's helpful guidance too. And then about the application process, do you recommend that students apply MD and MD PhD, that they're able to delineate, like, I would do either one. I don't care. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
And so this is where there's split opinion among MD PhD programs. I mean, for our program, I say, apply to both. You apply either MD or MD PhD to WashU, because 95% of our MD students do research, so it's a research intensive place. So, and we accept transfers from the medical school. So if you don't get into the MD PhD, but you come from med school, you can apply the next year to transfer in. So, so at our school, it's not a big deal, but I do understand where somebody say, well, you are sort of hedging. And so are you really committed to this? And so I do know there are some programs where, if you were to indicate sort of either MD or MD PhD, it might be considered a negative at that institution.
Yeah, it's tough. Like you said, there's not one consent. There's not a consensus among programs on this, and I've seen and heard from the MD side that if we see somebody who's playing MD and MD PhD or MSTP, it's like, well, if we put them in the MD, but they get into MSTP, they're gone. Right. Because that's probably their first choice. Yeah. MD might be a backup for them. And then the plan B would be potentially start MD. And then, like you said, talk to the MSTP people once you get here and be like, hey, do you have any room for next year? Can I kind of try to show you my chops this year? What can I do? And then transfer into MSTP sophomore or like second year or third year kind of thing. So I've heard the same on my end. Like some people are like, oh, we don't care if they do MD or they apply MD, PhD or MSTP. We'll look at them. But some people are like, I don't know. It is. We know if they get into MSTP, they're gone. And that's an acceptance we already put out. And I could have gone to somebody else who was like, I am all gun ho on MD and you don't have to worry about me. Yeah. So.
Well, I used to say in the old day, it only offer of admission only cost you like a 40-cent stamp. I don't know what stamps cost nowadays. They're probably $1 or something, but and now they don't even send acceptance letters by mail, right? It's all done by email, I guess, or calling people up. So, yeah.
What about just we're getting down to the end of these questions here about the kind of the global questions, but how much does it ultimately cost to complete an MD PhD program?
Well, now is this what it costs?
MSTP. Yeah, okay. MSTP. I think what I want listeners to know is that MSTP programs have a big job. And because they are looking very closely and trying to predict if you're going to be a successful MSTP graduate. And it's a huge financial, they're laying out a lot of through the NIH dollars, a huge financial commitment to these students. So what kind of debt do the students come out with?
Well, hopefully they come out with none, and it's going to vary. So, Cleveland, like St. Louis, is not an expensive place to live. So our students should come out debt free unless they have a extravagant lifestyle. They buy the Corvette or whatever they do. Or
my financial aid.
Right. But there are places where it's more expensive. I remember going to a review of another program in a very expensive city, and we were interviewing the dean, and he was very proud. So we built this subsidized housing for students, and I said, really? And he said, yeah, it'll cost them $1,800 a month. And it's 450 square feet. And I just thought, oh my God,
that's a lot of money. Yeah.
You could buy a house in St. Louis for $1,800 a month.
Mortgage. That's a decent mortgage. So
I think it does vary, but ideally, and that's why the NIH started funding these. Going back to what we discussed earlier, they said debt is something that will prevent individuals from pursuing a career in academics. And so they expect us to have a stipend that is reasonable and will cover, the cost of living. And so the debt to the program is about, $600,000 per student. That's what we spend, in tuition and stipend over, the 7 or 8 years of the students in the program. The student shouldn't have to pay anything. All tuition should be covered, and they should have a stipend that would, provide for them, to cover their living expenses. Yep. And so that's the ideal. I think in most cases it does work that way. I think at one time, the concern was, well, the only people who can go into academics are people who come from, the top quintile, right? They're the only ones who could afford that. They have, family wealth that could allow them to do this. And I think that's one of the great things about the MD PhD is the NIH funding is it says, okay, well, we want people from, all different backgrounds to be physician scientists. It's really important for the biomedical research enterprise. And so I would say, MD PhD, you should be able to go through without incurring any debt. Now, that's not the reason to go into MD PhD, right?
You guys will sniff that out really quickly.
Right. Yeah. If we get a sense that, well, they're not really that committed, but they may have great metrics, but it may be that they're not really committed to, the physician scientist career. And so we try to figure that out in the interview.
So I think just to be clear that their tuition and fees is covered. And then there's a monthly stipend. So it's like you're given, I don't know, maybe $1,500 or $1,800 a month or something to cover your rent, and then miscellaneous costs, food, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So like the NIH, if you have funding from the NIH, they give us about $2,000 plus, a month to cover the stipend. And then like at our program, we, our stipend is actually currently $34,500 a year. And so, we recognize, okay, the NIH is not enough to cover,
right. So your school is kicking in a little more off the top.
Yes.
So for some students, depending on the program, that they may incur like some little bit of debt to help cover, just depends on what, or if you're going above the budget, going outside the stipend, then that's on you.
Right. Yeah.
And so, but at the end of the day, though, it is it's pretty amazing, but that gets back to what the philosophy of the ethos is, to break down those barriers of being able to send students or people into research or academic type of career pathways without having debt hanging over them.
Yes.
Let's see. Well, I think, Brian, we've kind of hit on all those. Real quick, what do you, I've been getting this question lately about multiple MCATs. Are MSTP programs concerned about maybe more than two MCATs? Do you guys have an opinion on that?
I know for our program, we just look at the highest MCAT. It doesn't matter. We don't average them or anything like that. It's interesting. I think I've seen fewer people taking multiple MCATs than in the past. I don't have the data, but it's just my impression. I'm not seeing as many people with more than one MCAT. And it could be, of course, they're taking the gap year, and so they have time to prepare for it. And then they hit that score they want right from the beginning, and they don't have to retake it. I think, programs might be concerned like they're 4 MCATs or something like that.
Yeah.
Particularly if there's no improvement, that's the thing. It's like, okay, you took it the first time, you got the 498, and then if you took it the second time, you just went to 500 or something. That's not going to be a significant improvement. Mm-hmm. But if you went from the 498 up to a 512 or something, then that would be we say, okay, they obviously did something different this time, and and the thing is, MCATs do have predictive value for how you're going to do on standardized tests that you have to take in med school, so we can't ignore them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you for that, because that very much goes in line with what I've talked with other admissions people too. It's very similar. So I think that at least one MSTP represents kind of similar takeaway from that. But I agree that admissions committees get a little nervous when they see 3, 4, 5, 6 attempts, and there's the needle's not moving significantly in the direction that you'd hope. Let's talk a little bit about the WashU highlights. What are some of those program highlights that you feel that make WashU unique, or a destination place for MSTP students?
Yeah. So, I was really fortunate when I took this job. I inherited a great program, and it was amazing. In fact, the guy that hired me, Stuart Kornfeld, he said, well, we got a great program here. Don't screw it up. And so
no pressure.
That's been my mantra for the last 28 years, is not screwing it up. So the university that is, the focus really is on research. And so we just have an amazing amount of research going on there. I think we're number 3 or 4 in NIH in terms of funding. So we just, you can find pretty much any kind of research you're interested in doing there. So broad research portfolio. We have, there's some areas of strength, definitely. And I look to where our MSTP students go, right? Because they interview around the country, they get accepted to all sorts of programs, and which ones end up here, what programs they go into. And it's like immunology, microbiology, genetics, neuroscience, computational biology. So I think just looking at that poll by applicants, they're telling you, okay, I'm going to go, if I'm interested in immunology, WashU is going to be a great place for me to go, or neuro, or whatever it might be. So, so we have a lot of researchers. I think you can choose from over 600 different labs. And we also have a large program, like I mentioned earlier, 25 students. And that could be a negative if you were just one of 25, because that's a lot of people to keep after. But, the great thing about our program is we really interact with students a lot. We have a weekly dinner seminar, and all students are invited to it, and we're there as well. And so we can talk to students who, a student may have a minor issue and they think, well, it's not enough to take the elevator up to the 5th floor to tell us about it. But, if they see us, while they're waiting to get their food in line at the dinner seminar, they may say, hey, I want to ask you this question. And so I think that one of the things we really pride ourselves on is being very hands-on with our students. And then, our staff is very experienced. I'm 28 years. My manager, she is 22 years. And then our coordinator, she is, I think, 14 years now. So, we've been there for a long time.
We've seen a lot.
Yeah.
So if something comes up, it's like, this is not the first time we've seen or dealt with
exactly.
this.
Yeah. So occasionally a student, they're very inventive.
Yeah.
They'll find a way to.
You're like, never saw this before.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think is because we have a big program, when a student, we talk about going off to the PhD, right? And so you've had this very communal experience as a med student, and basically do more or less the same thing every day with everyone else for, 16 months. And then you go off to the PhD. Well, now, let's say you go into biomedical engineering or, a program maybe we don't have as many MSTP students, you could be kind of isolated there. But because there are so many students, there's likely to be other MSTP students in the PhD program you're choosing. And through these, weekly dinner seminars, you're able to come back with your class cohort and, just share the travails of being a graduate student, because that's really challenging, actually.
Staying connected is important.
Yeah. And then finally, I think our students really contribute to our program and our institution in many ways. They're just like the Young Scientists program, a program for high school students in disadvantaged school districts, was started by MD PhD students to give these students lab experiences. We had the public health plunge. I mentioned earlier about Washington University having this very traditional curriculum, and really there wasn't anything about public health in it. And so we had MSTP students say, WashU is a great research institution, great clinical care, but we've got people living in poverty, half a mile from here who don't have access to good health care, who have really poor health outcomes. Why aren't we involved in that? And so, our MSTP students really take responsibility for making the institution better. And so it's a real pleasure to work with them. And we just started a summer program this year. And I came from a couple of students. They said, we need to have an MD PhD specific summer program for these undergrads. And we said, okay. And they put it together themselves, and they came up with ideas, and they are very much involved in running it, selecting students for the program, and then serving as their mentors and so on. So I mean, it's just a joy to work with these individuals. They're really smart, they're committed, and they want to give back to the community.
Well, you could argue too that any of these students that are going into MSTPs, they're going to be there for about 8 years, that they really, it sounds like these are really passionate people to begin with. They want to get involved and invested in their new community, whether they're from St. Louis or they're new transplant there because they're going to WashU, that we're going to be here a long time. So let's try to be a part not only of the research community, but of the greater community around the area.
Yeah. And they bring these experiences from across country. Only 5% of our students are from the St. Louis area, right? They're from, all over the country. Actually, we have, I think, students from 34 different countries in the program, and so they bring all these experiences, and it makes for a very rich environment. And they have different backgrounds. And that's the thing we want. We want students to learn from one another. We see that as being, something that's key. It's sort of, it's nothing formal, but it is something that, we think is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a typical week. We mentioned a little bit earlier talking about the phase 1 of the curriculum. And I think WashU has a newer curriculum they rolled out the last year or so ago. 2 years. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what is a kind of an MSTP student's kind of typical day week look like in that first phase of those 16 weeks? And they're doing MD work and then they're doing some graduate work, I would assume.
Right. So what they take obviously the full medical school course load.
Sure.
And that includes, there's going to be some lecture-based learning, a lot of team-based learning, problem solving. You'll have opportunities to get clinical exposures early. And so you'll be doing that. But as an MSTP student, we have a weekly, what we call the MSTP thread. And this is a seminar for the phase 1 students. And so we look at, like, they're doing something in the GI tract, let's say, and we will find a faculty member and ask them to cover some landmark papers in like Nobel. It's often Nobel laureates' work or something like that. The seminal paper that just was the inflection point for the entire field. And so they will present that work to the class, and then the next week there'll be two MSTP students who will work with that faculty member to present a journal club. So they will read other papers that are, either came from that or maybe are, have shed new light and maybe undercut some of the conclusions or something like that. And so these students have an opportunity to really learn how to take a deep dive into a paper and then build their presentation skills, being mentored by this faculty member who is, an expert in the field. Yeah. So that's something that I think is really, we designed it specifically for this, what we call the gateway curriculum for the medical school. And it's been very, very successful. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, we have the weekly seminars that the first year, and that's really good because that builds vertical integration, to have first years and third years and, 7th or 8th years there at the same time. I mean, it is very helpful. And I see students talking before and after, the younger students saying, well, okay, I'm thinking about these 3 faculty, asking a senior student, what do you think about that? And so I think we really do try to build that communal element as much as possible.
And kind of wrapping that part up, what would be something that, because I mentioned, I really like your website. It really lays out in detail so many unique aspects about your program. What's like the stuff about your program that we can't find in a brochure, or it might be a little, kind of cheesy to put on a website that you like people to know about the program? Well,
I'll just go back. I mean, I used to answer that question when applicants say, "What's special about the program?" I would say, "Me." I'm the special.
Did I mention me?
Yeah. What are you going to get about that? But I think it is kind of related to that. It's because we have this close relationship between the staff and faculty in the program and the students. And, I think that is something that's really special. I mean, our coordinator, like I say, she knows everybody who's going out with whom in the program and who's pregnant or who's this or who's that, and so, I think we do try to build that. Family is probably not the right word, but just this community of people who are going to be supportive, and it does. It matters. Well, for instance, at Case Western, the director of your MD PhD program is Cliff Harding.
Yeah,
and he was. Yeah, so I worked in his PhD lab. He was getting his PhD when I started at Washington University in 1983, and even if I hadn't had the exposure, still just knowing him, I know all the the alumni around the country and the rest of the staff do, and we keep in contact with them, and they send us, when they have a life event, they're getting married or something like that, they'll send us their picture, even though they may have graduated from the program 5 or 10 years before. So I think that's something that to me, it means a lot to me, and I think the students feel that as well.
Yep, I'm thinking of our own MSTP students because they're here so long, and it's like you really like, gosh, you're still around. That's great. I'm like, oh, and then when they graduate, I'm like, no, this is the year. Like it's been 8 years, and so it really is. It's a very interesting program and how the students grow so much over time, over a long period of time. So, one thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of the interview day process, because it's different for MSTP candidates. So what's the interview day process for students that are coming to interview for your MSTP program?
Yeah. And it's more or less the same, whether it's virtual or in person, and we're still virtual, and we may keep virtual. I don't know. That's a debate among MD, PhD programs, whether we should stay with virtual, because there's a lot of real good things about it. But you have to have the med school interviews, right? And so you have 2 medical school interviews, 1 open file, 1 closed file. And that's the same as regular MD candidates. And then we have something that's almost unique. There are only a few schools that are doing it, a committee interview. And we've been doing this since 1969. We think it works really well. And basically, you come into a room and there are a dozen faculty seated around the table. And they're the ones who are going to make the decision on your application. And you've basically got 20 minutes to talk about your research. And it's not a presentation, like you go to a meeting, you present for, 12 minutes, you take 3 minutes of questions at the end. No, you sit down at the head of the table and they say, well, tell us about a project you've been working on. It's up to you to decide what you want to tell us about. And so they start talking, and then the committee starts asking questions. And so that's kind of unique. Like I say, just 3 or 4 other programs do that. And it really helps our first of all, the people who are making a decision on your application all have the chance to ask you a question, have the chance to see you, as opposed to you interviewing with 1 or 2 committee members, and then they have to come back to the rest of the committee and sell you on your candidacy. So, we feel this is the fairest way to do it. And it actually, our committee loves doing this. They say we get to talk to some of the smartest students in the country doing great research at fantastic labs. And yeah, it's outside my field, but I'm learning so much here by being here. And so they, the committee actually really likes doing, we have a waiting list of people to serve on our committee. I think it's the only committee in the university. So it's a benefit to us. And for the applicants, I think, for them, they get over their initial nervousness, and then, they find, the committee is not drilling them with questions.
It sounds intimidating when the way you set it up like that, but I have to think there's a human element there, that they know that the candidate's going to be nervous. So we're not here to rake you over the coals and make you feel like you don't know what you're talking about. Am I correct?
Yes, no, that's right. And so sometimes, occasionally a candidate will sort of lose their way, and, then somebody on the committee will, throw them a life preserve or whatever, and sort of take it back and say, okay, well, let's talk about this. And you are nervous, and something you may know, you just forget in that committee interview. And one of the ways we sort of address that is at the end of the day, you meet with one of the committee members one-on-one, and, you can go back over your committee interview if you want, offer more information, or say, that question that I was asked, I didn't quite, I don't think my answer was understood, or maybe I didn't have an answer, but now I'm thinking about it. This is what I think, the answer should be.
Okay.
So it is a friendly environment. And then you do have also individual faculty interviews. You meet with 3 or maybe 4 faculty whose research you're interested in. And we do get feedback from those, but, to be honest about it, I think those interviews do not weigh as much in the admissions decision. If the committee's on, somebody's, right on the line, not sure whether you want to offer admission or not, then those would become more important. But usually those faculty love everybody they interview, because they, they're interested in their research. So it's like, okay, this is a future PhD student for my lab potentially. So, so they may be not as discerning as like the committee may be. And also they see, maybe 5-6 applicants a year, whereas the committee sees 100 applicants a year. So they have a much, a broader base to make a evaluation on.
How should a student prepare for an interview day? In this kind of setting or environment? Should they, they should know their research front and back, up and down, and you mentioned earlier, any papers that they shared in their application that they were on. Yes. Should they be able to explain the research in kind of layman's terms to people too? Yeah.
So I think that's important, because one of the, we have an orientation before the committee interview with everyone. We say, okay, watch your use of jargon, because you can do that in your lab. People understand it, but recognize that of the dozen people around the table, there may be only one or two who are even close to your research, and a lot more likely than not, there are none. And so you need to be able to explain to people who are really, really smart, but they, aren't in your field. And so, the idea is, I recommend that people, and do this in their essays as well, their research essay, who did you work with? What does the lab work on? Why is it important? That their work, how does it relate to human health or whatever, the bigger picture?
Why are we doing this?
Yeah, exactly. And then what was your hypothesis? How did you test it? Why did you use these particular, you did this versus that, and then talk about your results. And so I think if you sort of follow that approach, and again, you can't control that committee interview because they're going to, ask questions, but still, if you have that outline in your mind, you can go back to it. And I also recommend that in that interview, don't choose to necessarily talk about what you're working on right now, because some people, they'll be on an exciting project. Maybe they just started 6 months before and they don't have much data. And so they can't really talk about data, and we don't get a sense of how do they interpret data. So in that case, it may be better to talk about, what you did before that, because maybe you had, a year or something on that project, and you can better, talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great stuff right there. That's good. And I think that another thing that I heard is like, don't feel like, okay, it's a 20-minute committee interview. Don't feel like I have to prepare a 20-minute presentation.
Right.
You're going to give maybe a little intro about here's what I'd like to talk about today, give a little bit of info, and then there's going to be then the questions are going to start to come from the committee members. So it's not like you get to take up 20 minutes and then at the end you're like, okay, that's it. Next.
Right. I was going to say, and the thing that I will recommend to applicants, if you can set up a question, like don't put all the information out there, leave something out there. Because I love going to a presentation and somebody asks a question and the person says, that's an excellent question, and I've got a slide for it. And, of course, you can't have a slide in the community, but still you have the answer. And so you kind of, you can sort of present it in a way, don't reveal everything, and give them an opportunity to ask a question. And then you can come back with a killer answer. And, it can, has a very favorable impression on the faculty, I think, when you're able to do that.
So you said no slides. Can I diagram anything, or can I show you? Could I bring in like a folder with like pictures and stuff, or is it no?
Yeah. And see, for the committee interview specifically, no. And we have this rule: you can't even use the whiteboard. And only 2 times in my 28 years has anybody used a whiteboard. So that's about 3,000 applicants or something. and one, he asked to use the whiteboard, and they said no, and he didn't hear me. Went up and drew on it anyway. It was almost like a sacrilege. But they actually admitted him. He's now a faculty member at WashU. So I won't say it was a deal breaker, but it's really talking about it, as opposed to having, any sort of aids. You just have to be able to describe it. And now when you go to the individual interviews, that could be different. And so in that case, maybe you have in your back on your phone. I don't know what people think. Oh, I guess if you're doing virtually, then maybe you say, can I share my screen? And you throw the data up there or something like that. So I'd say being prepared to do that would be good. And always ask first, but be able to do it with, out that, if you can go to it, if they let you go to it, that's fine. But if not, be able to, talk about your research, in a very sophisticated way without having to go to, the slides or whatever.
As far as the application goes, do you, and because students sometimes they're submitting their work in May and June, and then they get interviews in October, November. Do you let them send you updates along the way? Do you want to hear if they've gotten a poster presentation and if they haven't been invited for an interview yet, or it's like, don't call us, we'll call you?
No, we actually welcome that because so we get about 600 applications a year, and we have to figure out how to interview. And we know based on past experience that better than half of those will get into an MD PhD program, right? And so we're trying to figure out, okay, of the 600, what 100 will we interview? And those updates can actually help. And so if you've applied to us, and hopefully you apply early, I know that's what everybody says, apply early, but so it gets to be, early September and you haven't heard from us mid-September, feel free to say, particularly if you do have an update, if you say, hey, I just want to let you know, my abstract was accepted to the Society for Neuroscience, and here's a copy of it, and that will help us, because we'll say, all else being equal, if someone's taking that extra little step of sending us an update, we'll say, okay, we'll interview her because she was able to, she showed a little more interest. So I would say, don't be a pest.
It's not stalking. It just...
Yeah.
I think, is there anything else that you wanted to share about the WashU program that before we there's one more thing I want to talk about, that's trends that you've been seeing, but is there anything else we didn't touch on in our conversation today about the program?
So, I would like to say that, we have a great program, but I do think that individuals have to make the choice based on what's going to be best for them. And I would say, whether you're looking at our program or another program, look at the community, because you're going to be in that community for 7 or 8 years, maybe 9 years, just depends how things go with the thesis. And so you want to make sure that the students there, the institution, wherever you're going to live, that's going to be a good fit. And I think that's much better that you're going to be in a place where it's going to be good for you personally, because this is a challenging pathway without a doubt. And if you're not happy in your living situation, or you don't feel like you fit in with the rest of the students, I think it's it may lead to that attrition we talked about, or it may be that, you complete the program, but you're kind of miserable, and you may conflate, being miserable in your personal situation with, maybe not liking research. And maybe the fact is you really would be an excellent researcher, but, you just said, oh, this is just too hard for me. So, and I think our students, generally, the vast majority are very happy, that they made this choice.
But boy, 8 years is a long time to be grouchy.
Yeah.
You really got to think long and hard if you have decisions if you're in the fortunate position to be able to choose between multiple programs. You really should give it a lot of soul searching, and looking at it from a variety of different angles. So I think it's an excellent point. You seem to have a good finger on the pulse of kind of the national view. So what kind of trends you've been seeing in the kind of greater MSTP demographics over the last several years or so?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really great is over the last 15 years, we've seen female applicants and students reach parity with male. For a long time, is about 35% of the applicant pool and program population, but that has changed. And our program, the last 3 years, we've had majority female in the class. Now it's small majority, like 54%, versus 46, but still, go back.
Significant.
Yeah. And so that's really good. And we see that actually the national pool hasn't grown that much. I mentioned there was the blip during the COVID year, but it really hasn't grown that much. What's happened is there are fewer males applying and more females are applying for MD PhD. So it's about 2,000 people a year applying to MD PhD programs, and about 800 or so will get offered positions, and then 700 or so will end up in an MD PhD. And so those 100 that do not, they could have done the soul searching and said, I like doing research, but after going on all these interviews and talking to students in these programs and also faculty, I realized that this is not going to be the best fit for me. So I think that's what happens there. The other thing we see is minority numbers, underrepresented minority numbers are growing, not as rapidly as we achieve gender parity, but it is better, and that's something I think all programs are acutely aware of it and are really doing trying to do innovative sort of outreach to and that's one of the reasons why we developed our summer undergraduate program was to provide more opportunities for individuals from minority backgrounds to be able to gain the exposure to MD, PhD, and be able to make a decision about whether or not they think they'd be a good fit, and sort of demystify it for them. Because I think, there is this thing, oh God, you got to have publications and a 4.0,
right.
and, 522 MCAT or something. And that's not the case at all.
Yeah. What about international students?
Yeah. So international students, we are seeing that we receive about, 50 to 60 applications a year from international students. And our program is fortunate because and this is something international students should be aware of. Not all programs will fund international students.
Yes. Yep.
And so that's something you really need to be careful about. And actually, I'll send you a link to the AAMC website because they have a list of program policies and that will say whether or not they accept and fund international students. And so we currently have 35 international students out of our 200 students in the program. So we have a good number, and they're funded exactly the same way. And they all went to school in the United States. It's not like they went to school, in Germany or China. It's just that they are not citizens, and the NIH will not fund non-citizens or non-permanent residents.
Yep, that's a good distinction because, like our CASES MSTP program, we don't accept international students because we just use the NIH funding that we get for our slots. We have like 14 to 15 slots, but there are, like you said, there's institutions like WashU, and I think maybe Hopkins. I think they do international. They accept international.
They may take some. I've seen. I guess I
don't know why that came to mind.
But. Yeah, Cornell.
Weill
Cornell and Penn. So yeah, there are a number of programs that will take them, but that AAMC website will have information.
Okay, I'll get that link and we'll put it in the description. Hey, listen, Brian, I think that's gonna be about as much as we can cram into this conversation. But
this has been delightful. I really enjoyed talking with you and sharing these insights. I hope that it's helpful for you.
I really think it is, and it's such useful information, and hopefully that I think students are really going to appreciate it, and advisors, because I think, like you said, when you're just talking about some students, sometimes think MSTP is kind of this black box of like, I need to have this and that. And in actuality, you've dispelled in our conversation today a lot of those kind of misconceptions and myths about what is really necessary for these programs. So thank you so much. It's been great to have you.
Well, I would just add one thing here. Feel free to reach out to MD PhD program directors or administrators. We welcome queries from advisors, from students. We're always ready to answer questions. So happy to have anybody email me or whatever.
Excellent advice. I will include a contact for your program in the description. So I'll see you around. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.